There was a time when Britain was not the world's superpower. It was a small island kingdom on the edge of Europe, fighting for survival, wealth, and influence. But from that island emerged an empire, unlike anything the world had ever seen. It began with a nation searching for power and a company that would help turn trade into conquest. From India to the Caribbean, from Africa to Asia, Britain built an invisible system of money, military power, commerce, and control that stretched across the globe. But behind the wealth was another story: exploitation, resistance, and enormous human costs. And eventually, the empire that ruled the world faced the forces it could no longer control: war, debt, rebellion, and decline. This is the complete story of the British Empire. But to understand how Britain conquered the world, we first have to go back to the beginning. Long before British ships ruled the oceans, before India became the jewel of the crown, before London became the financial capital of the world, Britain was not an empire. It was a vulnerable island on the edge of Europe, invaded by the Romans, raided by the Vikings, conquered by the Normans. For centuries, Britain was not the hunter. It was the hunted. And yet, somehow, this same island would go on to build the largest empire humanity had ever seen. So the question is not what the British Empire became, but how a place like this made it possible at all. To understand the empire, we must first understand the island. Chapter 1. The Island at the Edge of the World. An island is never truly alone, but it is always aware of its distance from everything else. Britain's story begins not with empire, but with separation. A land surrounded by cold seas, cut off from the European mainland, shaped as much by water as by soil. That isolation would become its defining condition long before it became its advantage. When the Romans arrived in 43 AD, Britain was not a unified kingdom. It was a mosaic of tribes, Celtic societies scattered across forests, hills, and river valleys. Rome brought order, roads, taxation, and fortifications. For nearly 4 centuries, Britain existed as the distant northern edge of a vast imperial system. But even Rome, with all its power, treated Britain differently. It was always somewhat peripheral, valuable, but never central. And then, in 410 AD, Rome withdrew. It did not fall in Britain. It simply left. What remained was not stability, but silence. The structures that had held authority together began to dissolve. Roads were still there, but the system that made them meaningful was gone. Towns survived, but not the coherence of a unified province. Authority fractured into smaller, competing centers of power. In the absence of Rome, Britain did not become one kingdom. It became many. Across the island, local rulers emerged: warriors, chieftains, petty kings, each controlling limited territories, each vulnerable to the next. Unity, which Rome had imposed from above, was replaced by fragmentation from within. And beyond the horizon, history was already moving. Germanic peoples began crossing the North Sea: Angles, Saxons, Jutes, settling gradually, not as a single invasion, but as a slow transformation of the land itself. What followed was not immediate conquest, but cultural replacement over generations. Old identities faded, new languages formed. The idea of Britain itself began to change shape. Yet even in this chaos, something important was happening beneath the surface. Isolation was doing something Rome never intended. Without a strong continental empire to absorb or dominate it, Britain was forced to develop inward. Survival depended not on expansion, but adaptation. Not on imperial control, but on resilience. Every generation born into this fractured landscape inherited a single truth. No outside power would permanently stabilize this island. Order had to be created locally, repeatedly, and often violently. And so Britain became a land conditioned by uncertainty. Geography had drawn a boundary around it, but that boundary did not protect it. It exposed it. It turned the sea into both shield and barrier, separating Britain from Europe, while also denying it the stability of belonging fully to it. By the time new kingdoms began to form, Northumbria, Mercia, Wessex, the island was already shaped by centuries of disruption. Unity would eventually return, but it would not resemble Rome. It would be forged from conflict, negotiation, and necessity. And this raises a deeper question that defines everything that follows. Was Britain's isolation a curse that delayed its rise, or the very condition that forced it to evolve differently from the rest of Europe? Because sometimes distance does not weaken a place. Sometimes it prepares it. Chapter 2. When the Vikings came. Sometimes a nation is not born in peace, but in the shock of repeated invasion. By the late 8th century, the relative silence of post-Roman Britain was broken, not by a single conquering army, but by waves arriving from the sea. They came without warning. Fast ships cutting through cold waters, raiders who struck coastal monasteries, villages, and trade centers before disappearing back into the horizon. At first, they were seen as isolated attacks, local disturbances, manageable violence at the edge of the kingdom. But the pattern soon became impossible to ignore. These were the Vikings. What began as raids slowly transformed into something more permanent. They did not only plunder, they settled. They did not only destroy, they occupied. Over time, large parts of northern and eastern Britain came under Scandinavian control, reshaping the political and cultural map of the island. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, already fragmented, now faced a new kind of pressure. Not internal rivalry, but external survival. Among those kingdoms, Wessex stood at a breaking point. Many others collapsed under Viking expansion. But in Wessex, a different response emerged. Not retreat, but reconstruction. This is where Alfred enters history. Alfred the Great did not inherit stability. He inherited collapse in progress. His kingdom was under constant threat, its territory shrinking, its future uncertain. Yet his response was not simply military resistance. It was institutional rebuilding. He reorganized defenses, strengthened fortified towns, and restructured the army into a system that could respond quickly rather than react slowly. He understood something that many rulers of his time did not. Survival was no longer about a single battle. It was about endurance. The turning point came not in total victory, but in division. A treaty eventually formalized the control of the Vikings over the north and east, what became known as the Danelaw. It was not peace in the traditional sense. It was a recognition that Britain had become a shared space of competing powers, cultures, and laws. And yet, paradoxically, this division created something new. The pressure of invasion forced consolidation in the south. Wessex expanded its influence, absorbing weaker territories, pushing toward a broader identity. Out of fragmentation and foreign settlement, the idea of England began to take shape, not as a unified dream, but as a defensive necessity. Constant invasion had done something unexpected. It had forced the scattered Anglo-Saxon world to think in larger terms than before. Survival required coordination. Coordination required identity, and identity, once formed, rarely disappears. Britain was no longer simply a collection of vulnerable kingdoms. It was becoming a nation shaped by resistance. And beneath it all, a deeper pattern was forming, one that would repeat across centuries. External pressure does not always destroy a society. Sometimes it compels it to become something stronger than it was before. Chapter 3, 1066, The Last Conquest. Some battles decide more than a war. They decide what a country will become. In the autumn of 1066, England stood at a moment of fragile succession. A kingdom already shaped by centuries of invasion now faced its most decisive rupture. Not from Viking raiders this time, but from a calculated, organized conquest across the Channel. The claim to the English throne had become contested, and the uncertainty created opportunity. From Normandy came William, a ruler with discipline, planning, and a belief that legitimacy could be enforced through victory. What followed was the Battle of Hastings. It was not a chaotic clash of equals. It was a turning point defined by endurance, miscalculation, and exhaustion. The English army, already weakened from earlier conflict in the north, faced a Norman force that combined cavalry, archers, and coordinated battlefield strategy in ways England had not fully adapted to. By the end of the day, the outcome was irreversible. Harold Godwinson was dead. The Old English order collapsed with him. But conquest rarely ends with a battle. It begins a transformation. William did not simply replace a king, he replaced a system. Norman rule brought a new elite structure layered on top of the existing society. Land ownership was redistributed on a massive scale. The ruling class shifted almost overnight, not just in leadership, but in language, culture, and governance. Old English aristocracy was dismantled and replaced by Norman nobility, loyal to a centralized authority. At the heart of this transformation was feudalism, a system that tied land, loyalty, and military service into a tightly controlled hierarchy. Power no longer flowed loosely through regional kings and nobles. It was reorganized into a structured chain of obligation, extending directly from the monarch downward. This was not simply foreign domination, it was administrative reconstruction. Castles began to rise across the landscape, not only as military defenses, but as symbols of permanent control. Law, taxation, and land management were standardized in ways that created a more efficient, if more rigid, state. And yet, beneath the surface of conquest, something unexpected occurred. England did not fragment further under Norman rule. It consolidated. The very violence of the takeover forced the creation of stronger institutions. Resistance was suppressed, but governance became more systematic. Communication between regions improved. Authority became clearer, more centralized, and more enforceable than in the fragmented Anglo-Saxon period. This creates a historical paradox. England was conquered completely, yet out of that conquest emerged a more unified political structure than before. Which leads to a deeper question that defines this chapter of history. Why did England become stronger after being conquered? Because sometimes conquest does not erase a system. Sometimes it rebuilds it, more efficiently, more brutally, and more permanently than what existed before.
My lords, your hesitations are noted, but our royal will...
Chapter 4, Kings, Barons, and the Birth of Liberty. Power rarely surrenders willingly. It is always forced to change, by pressure, by conflict, or by necessity. By the early 13th century, England was no longer a fragmented post-conquest society. It was a structured kingdom, centralized, organized, and increasingly efficient under royal authority. But strength at the top often creates tension beneath it. The crown demanded taxes for wars across Europe. The barons, powerful landowners who controlled vast estates, began to question not only how much they were being taxed, but by what right decisions were being imposed upon them without consultation. Tension slowly turned into confrontation. In 1215, this conflict reached a breaking point at Runnymede. The king, under pressure from rebellion and political isolation, was forced into negotiation. The result was not a revolution, but a document, Magna Carta. At first glance, it was not about liberty, in the modern sense. It was about limiting arbitrary power. It stated that even the king was not above certain established laws and customs. It was a recognition that authority, if left unchecked, could become unstable, even for those who held it. But its importance was not in its immediate enforcement. It was in its precedent. For the first time in English political life, the idea was established that rule required consent, not just force. What followed was not a sudden democratic transformation, but a slow institutional evolution. Over the next centuries, advisory councils expanded into what would become Parliament. Initially, it was not a body of popular representation, but a practical mechanism. Kings needed money, and money required negotiation. Those who controlled wealth gained a voice in governance. Step by step, power became distributed. Not because rulers intended to share it, but because governing a complex kingdom made it necessary. As taxation systems grew more sophisticated, so did administrative structures. Laws became more formalized, less dependent on personal decree. The concept of the rule of law gradually took shape, not as an abstract philosophy, but as a practical safeguard against instability. England was becoming unusual compared to many contemporary kingdoms. In much of medieval Europe, power remained highly centralized in the monarchy or fragmented among competing nobles. But in England, a different balance was emerging. One where kings ruled, but not without constraint, where nobles resisted, but within a system that required negotiation, where authority was strong, but not absolute. This was not liberty as ideology, it was liberty as structure, a system shaped not by sudden enlightenment, but by repeated friction between authority and resistance. Each conflict leaving behind an institution, a precedent, a rule. And so a deeper pattern becomes visible. Unlike many kingdoms where power concentrated endlessly at the top, English kings were slowly drawn into a system where even sovereignty required agreement. Which leads to the central question of this chapter. How did a kingdom built on conquest gradually become a system where power had to justify itself? Because sometimes liberty is not granted, it is negotiated. Over centuries between those who rule and those who refuse to be ruled without condition. Chapter 5: 100 Years of War. Nations are often not discovered, they are forged, and sometimes they are forged in fire that lasts generations. What began in the 14th century as a dynastic dispute over claims to a foreign throne gradually evolved into something far larger than either side originally understood. The conflict between England and France was not a single war, but a prolonged series of campaigns, truces, betrayals, and renewed invasions that stretched across more than a century. At its core, the war began as a question of legitimacy. Who had the rightful claim to the French crown? But as time passed, that question became secondary to something more profound: survival, identity, and endurance. On the battlefield, the nature of warfare itself was changing. The English longbow emerged as a decisive instrument of power. At battles such as Crécy and Agincourt, disciplined infantry armed with longbows demonstrated that traditional aristocratic cavalry charges could be broken by coordination, training, and range. Warfare was no longer defined solely by nobility on horseback. It was increasingly shaped by organized common soldiers acting in formation. This shift carried political consequences. If common soldiers could influence the outcome of wars, then the structures that funded and organized them also gained importance. Armies required money, and money required consent. The crown could not wage prolonged war without negotiating resources with those who controlled taxation. Here, Parliament's role began to expand once again, not as a philosophical institution of democracy, but as a practical mechanism of war finance. The demands of prolonged conflict forced the monarchy into repeated consultation with representatives of landowners, merchants, and regional interests. War, in other words, made negotiation unavoidable. But perhaps the most lasting transformation occurred not on the battlefield, but in identity itself. Before the war, England was still a kingdom defined in opposition to others. During the conflict, it began to define itself internally. Language shifted toward English rather than French among the ruling classes. Shared victories and shared suffering began to produce a sense of collective identity that extended beyond regional loyalties. Heroes were remembered not simply as nobles, but as symbols of a broader national struggle. Defeats were not isolated failures, but shared experiences that reinforced unity. By the end of the conflict, England was no longer just a political territory ruled by a monarch. It was becoming something closer to a nation, bound by memory, language, and experience shaped through centuries of war. Yet this transformation was not planned. It was the unintended consequence of prolonged conflict. The same war that drained resources, destabilized regions, and strained institutions also produced stronger administrative systems, more coordinated governance, and a more cohesive political identity. Parliament gained influence. Taxation systems became more structured. Military organization became more centralized. And so a paradox emerges again in history. War weakens societies in the short term, but can strengthen the structure of states over the long term. Which leads to the central question of this chapter. Did war create the English nation? Because if identity can be shaped by shared struggle, then perhaps England was not simply defending itself during 100 years of war. It was, unknowingly, becoming itself. Chapter 6: Henry VIII and the English Revolution. Sometimes revolutions do not begin in the streets, but inside the mind of a single ruler. In the early 16th century, England appeared stable on the surface. The Tudor dynasty had ended decades of internal conflict, and royal authority was stronger than it had been in generations. Yet beneath this stability lay a deeper tension that stretched far beyond England itself. Because England was not only a kingdom, it was part of a religious world order. Across Europe, the Catholic Church in Rome stood as the ultimate spiritual authority. Kings ruled lands, but the Church defined legitimacy, marriage, inheritance, and moral order. No crown was fully independent from the authority of Rome, but power, once consolidated, often begins to question its limits. Henry VIII inherited a kingdom that was politically stable, but dynastically uncertain. The absence of a male heir became more than a personal concern. It became a question of succession, stability, and national survival. In a world where legitimacy depended heavily on lineage, uncertainty at the top could destabilize everything below it. What began as a request, annulment of a marriage, became a confrontation with an institution far older than any European throne. Rome refused. And in that refusal, a threshold was crossed. Henry did not merely challenge a religious decision. He challenged the structure that validated kingship itself. The result was not immediate chaos, but a deliberate and calculated restructuring of authority. The break with Rome was not only political, it was institutional. The king was declared the supreme head of the Church of England. Spiritual authority, once centralized in Rome, was now absorbed into the English crown. What had previously been two separate spheres, religion and monarchy, became unified under a single source of power. This was a transformation with no true historical precedent in England. It was not a rebellion from below, but a redefinition from above. Monasteries were dissolved, church lands were redistributed, wealth shifted into royal and noble hands, strengthening those loyal to the crown. Religious life was reorganized not just in doctrine, but in administration, property, and governance. The consequences extended far beyond theology. By removing papal authority, England severed one of its last major institutional ties to continental Europe. Political decisions no longer required religious approval from an external center of power. Diplomacy, law, and governance became increasingly internalized. England was becoming not just a kingdom with its own ruler, but a state operating under its own spiritual framework. This consolidation of authority strengthened the monarchy significantly, yet it also introduced a new long-term dynamic. Power that absorbed religious legitimacy also absorbed religious conflict. Future tensions over doctrine, identity, and authority would no longer be external. They would be internal. And so another pattern becomes visible in English history. Every expansion of centralized power creates new forms of internal pressure, but in the short term, the transformation was decisive. England was no longer spiritually subordinate to Catholic Europe. It had become politically and religiously self-contained, which leads to the central idea of this chapter. England did not simply reform its religion. It redefined the relationship between faith and sovereignty. And in doing so, it took another step away from being part of a European system and closer to becoming an independent global power. Chapter 7. The Day England Challenged an Empire. Empires are rarely decided on land alone. Sometimes the future of a nation is written on the waves. By the late 16th century, England was no longer the fragmented, vulnerable island it once had been. Centuries of invasion, internal consolidation, legal evolution, and religious separation had gradually reshaped it into a more centralized and self-aware state. Yet in the wider world, England was still not the dominant power. That position belonged to Spain. The Spanish Empire stretched across continents, rich in silver from the Americas, anchored by vast colonial holdings, and supported by one of the most powerful fleets in Europe. To many observers, Spain represented the peak of imperial strength in the early modern world. England, by comparison, was smaller, less wealthy, and politically more isolated. But under Elizabeth I, a different strategic vision began to take shape. Rather than competing directly on continental battlefields, England increasingly turned toward the sea. Maritime trade, privateering, and naval development began to receive greater strategic importance. The ocean was no longer a boundary. It was becoming a route of expansion, influence, and survival. This shift was not sudden. It emerged from necessity. England lacked the resources to dominate Europe's land wars, but it could invest in mobility, navigation, and naval capability. Over time, ships became not just instruments of transport, but tools of power projection. Tension with Spain escalated gradually through religious conflict, political rivalry, and maritime encounters that blurred the line between commerce and warfare. By 1588, that tension reached its climax. The Spanish Armada was launched with the intention of securing dominance over the English Channel and enabling a larger campaign against England itself. It was a display of imperial confidence, an assertion that naval supremacy could be enforced through scale and coordination. England responded not with a larger empire, but with a more flexible one. Smaller, faster ships, greater maneuverability, tactical adaptation rather than rigid formation. The English Navy did not seek direct confrontation at equal scale. It sought disruption, endurance, and advantage through movement. Storms and logistics compounded Spain's difficulties, but the outcome also reflected a deeper shift in naval warfare, the beginning of modern maritime strategy. When the Armada failed to achieve its objectives, it did more than end a military campaign. It altered perception. England had not defeated Spain through overwhelming strength, but through adaptability and naval innovation. It was a symbolic turning point, proof that a smaller power could resist a larger imperial system through control of the sea. Elizabeth's reign thus marked more than political stability. It marked the beginning of a new orientation in English history. The land had shaped England's survival for centuries. Now the sea would shape its future. Trade routes, exploration, and maritime enterprise began to expand in importance. Private ventures received royal support. The idea that wealth and power could be built beyond Europe's continental constraints slowly took root. And so, by the end of the Elizabethan era, England stood at a threshold. It was still not an empire, but it had begun to think like one. Because once a nation learns to look outward across the sea, not as a boundary, but as a path, its future is no longer confined to its geography. It expands with the horizon. In 1588, England had defeated the mightiest empire on earth. Yet it was still poor, still small, still vulnerable. No one, not even the English themselves, could imagine what lay ahead. But something had changed. For the first time in its history, the island no longer feared the world beyond its shores. It had begun to look outward, and somewhere beyond the horizon, an empire was waiting to be born. Britain had built the foundations, but foundations alone do not create an empire. Something else was needed, a machine capable of turning commerce into conquest. Before Britain ruled a quarter of the world, before red-coated soldiers marched across continents, before the Union Jack flew over India, Africa, and the seas, a group of merchants sat around tables, signed contracts, sold shares, and chased profits. No king declared a great conquest. No army launched an invasion. Instead, an empire began with investors. Banks, trade routes, and merchant ships would prove just as powerful as cannons. which raises a question historians still debate today. Was the British Empire built by armies or by merchants and money? Chapter 1: A Nation of Traders. Before Britain commanded vast armies, before royal governors ruled distant colonies, before the Union Jack flew over a quarter of the world, England was simply a nation looking for a way to survive. It possessed no endless streams of silver like Spain. It had no mighty continental armies like France. Even the oceans were dominated by others. Portugal controlled the route around Africa, while Dutch merchants seemed to own global commerce itself. By the beginning of the 17th century, England appeared to be a minor player in a world already divided among stronger powers. Yet history often rewards those who adapt rather than those who dominate. Unable to compete through sheer force, England turned toward something different: trade. London's merchants understood that fortunes no longer depended solely on land or noble titles. Wealth could be created through ships, cargo, and distant markets. A successful voyage could generate profits that entire estates could never match. Ambition began spreading far beyond the royal court. Merchants invested in overseas expeditions. Shipbuilders expanded their docks. Port cities became centers of opportunity. A new commercial spirit was taking shape, and with it emerged a different vision of national power. Unlike Spain, whose empire relied heavily on treasure extracted from the Americas, England increasingly relied upon enterprise. But overseas, trade carried enormous risks. Storms destroyed ships, pirates attacked convoys, wars disrupted sea routes. A single disaster could wipe out the savings of an individual merchant. To overcome these dangers, English businessmen embraced a revolutionary idea. Instead of one wealthy person financing an expedition, many investors would contribute money together. Risks would be shared. So would rewards. This simple concept transformed commerce. It gave birth to the joint stock company, a financial innovation that allowed ordinary investors, wealthy nobles, and merchants to participate in ventures that would have been impossible alone. Capital became collective, profit became scalable, and risk became manageable. For the first time, enormous sums of money could be mobilized for projects extending across entire oceans. This was more than a new business model. It represented a new way of thinking. England was learning that wealth could generate power, and power could create even greater wealth. Across London, coffee houses buzzed with conversations about trade, investments, and opportunities abroad. Ships arriving from distant lands brought not only goods, but also stories of immense riches waiting beyond the horizon. Competition among European powers was becoming increasingly global, and England intended to secure its place. The country's geography offered another advantage. As an island nation, it naturally looked outward. The sea connected England to the world. Maritime commerce became part of its identity. Over time, merchants gained influence that had once belonged almost exclusively to aristocrats. Economic success elevated new families and strengthened the growing middle class. The foundations of a different kind of empire were quietly being laid, not on battlefields, not through conquest, but through contracts, investments, and commerce. Long before British soldiers marched across Asia and Africa, another force had already begun reshaping the world. It wore no uniform, it carried no flag, and yet it would prove every bit as powerful. The merchants had arrived. Chapter 2: The Age of Capital Networks. A single investor could change a voyage, but a network of investors could reshape a nation. As English overseas trade expanded, individual ventures became too large, too slow, and too risky to rely on isolated funding. The challenge was no longer discovery, it was scale. Out of this pressure emerged a new financial architecture, coordinated capital networks that linked merchants, aristocrats, guild members, and emerging urban elites into shared ventures. Ownership was no longer tied to a single ship or a single voyage. It became divisible, transferable, and expandable across multiple enterprises at once. Wealth began to circulate through participation rather than possession. This shift quietly altered the structure of English commerce. Investment was no longer a private act of risk-taking. It became a coordinated system of expectation management. Returns depended not on one successful expedition, but on a continuous chain of voyages distributed across regions. Economic behavior started to resemble an interconnected web rather than isolated transactions. Information gained a new role in this system. News from ports, letters from agents abroad, and reports from returning sailors carried financial weight. Decisions were increasingly shaped by timing rather than territory. In this environment, influence shifted toward those who could mobilize trust at scale. Reputation became a form of capital. Reliability became an economic asset, and access to information became as valuable as access to goods. This created a subtle but important transformation. Commerce was no longer just about exchange. It was about coordination across distance. England was learning how to synchronize money, time, and geography into a single operating system of trade. And within this system, something larger was beginning to take shape. An institution capable of binding all these networks into one unified structure. Chapter 3. Charter of Power. Power rarely announces itself at birth. It usually arrives disguised as administration. In 1600, a royal charter granted legal identity to a group of merchants operating in Asian trade routes. At first glance, it appeared to be a commercial license, permission to pursue overseas profit under state recognition. But the structure embedded within it carried long-term consequences far beyond trade. This charter did something unusual. It created a permanent institutional body with continuity beyond individual investors or single voyages. It allowed collective ownership to persist across generations, while maintaining legal recognition under the English crown. This combination of permanence and authority gave the organization a unique form of legitimacy. Unlike temporary trading ventures, this entity could negotiate as a unified actor. It could sign agreements, maintain assets, and establish long-term operational presence abroad without dissolving after each expedition. Over time, its structure developed internal governance systems. Decision-making shifted toward centralized boards, while field operations were delegated to overseas representatives. This separation between strategy and execution made expansion more efficient and scalable. In foreign regions, the organization adapted quickly to local conditions. It learned to operate within existing political frameworks rather than replacing them immediately. Agreements were prioritized over confrontation. Commercial stability was prioritized over territorial control. This allowed gradual embedding into regional economies without immediate large-scale conflict. What made this development historically significant was not its initial size, but its institutional durability. It could accumulate experience, retain profits, and reinvest continuously without resetting after each venture. Most trading entities of the era failed due to fragmentation. This one did not. It persisted, and persistence created influence. With time, its operations expanded beyond simple commerce. It managed logistics, secured agreements, and maintained its own armed protection units where necessary to safeguard assets. Authority gradually extended alongside economic activity. The boundary between private enterprise and state-backed legitimacy began to blur. What began as a chartered trading group evolved into a hybrid structure, part commercial organization, part geopolitical actor. And within that transformation lay the blueprint of a new kind of global power system, not based solely on conquest, not based solely on trade, but on institutional continuity supported by capital and authority combined. Chapter 4. Across the Atlantic. A coastline divided by 3 continents. Ships moving like veins through an emerging global body. And wealth being extracted, transferred, and multiplied across oceans that had once seemed infinite barriers. The Atlantic was not merely a body of water. It became a commercial engine. By the 17th century, European powers were no longer isolated competitors. They were interconnected through a vast maritime system linking Europe, Africa, and the Americas. This triangular network reshaped global economics in ways no single empire could fully control. England entered this system later than Spain and Portugal, but it entered with increasing intensity. Sugar from Caribbean plantations, tobacco from Virginia, cotton from later colonies. These were not just commodities. They were catalysts of structural transformation. Entire ports in Britain expanded to handle the constant flow of goods. Liverpool, Bristol, and London turned into industrial gateways of global exchange. But the Atlantic economy was not built on simple trade routes. It was built on labor systems that intensified production at scale. Plantations in the Caribbean required a continuous workforce. This demand reshaped colonial economies and tied distant regions into a single profit-driven structure. Raw materials moved eastward, manufactured goods moved westward, and capital circulated between them, reinforcing a cycle of expansion. British merchants and financiers quickly recognized the scale of opportunity. Returns from Atlantic trade often exceeded traditional European commerce. Profits were reinvested into shipping, insurance, and industrial production, creating a self-reinforcing loop of accumulation. London's financial ecosystem adapted rapidly. Marine insurance firms reduced risks for long voyages. Credit instruments allowed merchants to operate far beyond their immediate cash reserves. Banks facilitated transactions that spanned continents. The flow of information was just as crucial as the flow of goods. News of market prices, shipping arrivals, and colonial demand determined investment decisions. Time delays across the ocean added uncertainty, but also opportunity for speculation. Competition among European powers intensified. Control over key ports and sea lanes became a strategic priority. Naval escorts accompanied merchant fleets, blurring the distinction between commercial protection and military presence. Gradually, economic expansion required institutional backing. Governments became more involved in securing trade routes. Navies expanded to defend commercial interests. Private merchants increasingly influenced state policy. This convergence of commerce and power marked a turning point. The Atlantic was no longer a distant frontier. It had become the core of an emerging global system in which Britain was steadily increasing its share of influence. Yet the system carried contradictions. Wealth accumulation in Europe depended on extraction elsewhere. Entire colonial economies were structured around external demand rather than internal development. The imbalance created a hierarchy of economic dependency that would shape global relations for centuries. Still, for Britain, the Atlantic represented something decisive: scale. Trade was no longer regional or continental. It was planetary in scope, and those who mastered this system gained advantages that went far beyond profit. They gained leverage over nations, industries, and future empires. By the end of this period, Britain was no longer just participating in Atlantic trade. It was beginning to dominate its rhythms. What had started as scattered voyages had become a structured global network, one that linked oceans, economies, and empires into a single expanding system of exchange. And at the center of it, a new kind of power was forming. Not purely military, not purely political, but fundamentally economic. A power built across the Atlantic.
Pirates on the horizon!
Chapter 5. Masters of the Sea. A storm does not recognize flags. Pirates do not respect borders, and oceans do not reward hesitation. In the early modern world, power was not measured only by land armies or royal thrones. It was decided on water. Whoever controlled the sea controlled the movement of goods, wealth, and influence across continents. For Britain, this realization became a turning point. As trade expanded across Asia, Africa, and the Americas, merchant ships turned into lifelines of national prosperity. But those lifelines were constantly under threat. Rival empires sought dominance over the same routes. Privateers attacked cargo vessels. Weather could erase months of investment in a single night. Survival required more than commercial ambition. It required maritime dominance. The Royal Navy evolved into the backbone of this strategy. Unlike many European states that focused heavily on land-based military power, Britain invested increasingly in ships, sailors, and naval infrastructure. Dockyards expanded. Shipbuilding techniques improved. Navigation methods became more precise. Control of the seas became a national priority rather than a commercial luxury. Merchant shipping and naval power began to operate in tandem. Trade fleets depended on protection, while the Navy relied on commercial expansion to justify its scale. The two systems reinforced each other, forming a unified maritime structure. Convoys became common practice. Warships escorted merchant vessels across dangerous waters. Strategic ports were secured to ensure uninterrupted supply chains. The ocean transformed into a regulated space of competition rather than chaos. Technological advancement played a crucial role in this transformation. Improved hull designs allowed ships to carry heavier cargo over longer distances. Better sails increased speed and maneuverability. Navigational tools reduced uncertainty in open waters, making long voyages more predictable. With each improvement, Britain's reach expanded further, but naval supremacy was not achieved through technology alone. It was also a matter of organization and discipline. Training systems produced highly skilled sailors. Command structures ensured coordinated operations across vast distances. Intelligence networks tracked rival movements and market conditions alike. Gradually, Britain developed the ability to project force globally without maintaining large land armies abroad. Sea power became strategic power. It influenced diplomacy, trade negotiations, and colonial expansion. Nations that depended on maritime routes found themselves increasingly vulnerable to British naval presence. Control of choke points and key harbors allowed Britain to shape global commerce without occupying entire territories. This subtle form of dominance proved more effective than direct conquest in many cases. By securing the flow of trade, Britain could influence entire regions economically before any formal political control was established. At the same time, the ocean served as a training ground for imperial expansion. Experience gained in naval warfare translated into logistical superiority in later colonial campaigns. Ships carried not only goods but also administrators, soldiers, and systems of governance. Gradually, the distinction between merchant vessel and military asset began to blur. Both served a single purpose: maintaining Britain's position in the global trading network. By the 18th century, Britain's maritime capacity had reached a level unmatched by any rival. Its fleets could operate across multiple theaters simultaneously. Its ports functioned as hubs of global exchange. Its sailors navigated routes that connected every major continent. The sea, once a barrier separating lands, had become Britain's greatest highway. And on that highway, Britain was no longer a participant. It had become the dominant force shaping movement itself. Mastery of the ocean was not just military achievement. It was economic control expressed through water. And with that control, the foundation of a global empire was being secured, one wave at a time. Chapter 6: The Money Revolution. A kingdom can lose a war and recover. It can lose territory and rebuild. But when it loses financial control, its future begins to collapse silently, from within. In early modern Europe, power was no longer determined only by land or armies. A new force was rising behind the scenes, invisible yet decisive. It was not forged on battlefields, but inside banks, credit systems, and financial institutions. Britain understood this shift earlier than most of its rivals. The transformation began with a simple realization. Large-scale warfare and global trade required far more capital than traditional royal treasuries could supply. Monarchs could no longer rely solely on taxation or emergency levies. They needed a system that could generate trust, mobilize resources, and sustain long-term borrowing. That system emerged through financial innovation. Government debt was restructured into a manageable instrument rather than a crisis trigger. Investors were now willing to lend money to the state, not as a favor, but as a calculated opportunity. Confidence replaced uncertainty, and expectation replaced fear. At the center of this transformation stood a crucial institution, the Bank of England. Its creation marked a shift in how money functioned within the state. Currency was no longer simply metal or coinage. It became a system of credit, backed by institutional credibility. Paper promises began to carry the weight of real wealth. This development changed everything. Suddenly, Britain could finance wars, expand its navy, and support global trade without waiting for immediate taxation. Money became flexible, expandable, and strategically deployable. Credit markets deepened across society. Merchants borrowed to invest in overseas ventures. Insurance companies reduced risks for long voyages. Bonds circulated among investors, turning future revenue into present capital. Finance was no longer a passive reflection of wealth. It became an active engine of expansion. London evolved into a financial center where capital moved faster than ships and information traveled quicker than goods. Decisions about war, trade, and colonization were increasingly influenced by those who controlled credit flows. A new class of power emerged, not aristocrats, not soldiers, but financiers. Their influence extended across government policy and global commerce. The state depended on their trust, and in return, they depended on the state's stability. This mutual dependency created a durable system. Political authority and financial institutions began reinforcing each other in ways previously unseen in European history. The implications were profound. Rival empires struggled with unstable currencies and unpredictable revenues. Britain, however, developed a relatively predictable financial environment that allowed long-term planning on a global scale. Capital could now be accumulated, allocated, and reinvested with remarkable efficiency. Wars became financially sustainable. Trade networks became expandable. Empires became administratively manageable. Even distant colonial enterprises were no longer isolated ventures. They were integrated into a wider financial system that connected investors in London to activities across oceans and continents. This integration blurred the boundary between domestic economy and global expansion. Every shipment of goods, every colonial tax, every trading contract fed back into the financial core of the empire. Money was no longer just a medium of exchange. It was a mechanism of control. And as Britain refined this mechanism, its global position strengthened without requiring proportional territorial expansion. The revolution was not loud. There were no dramatic conquests or symbolic declarations. Instead, change accumulated quietly through ledgers, interest rates, and credit agreements. By the 18th century, Britain had developed something extraordinary, a financial system capable of sustaining global ambition. Power was no longer limited by physical resources alone. It was multiplied through trust, structured through institutions, and projected across oceans through capital. And in that transformation, money ceased to be just wealth. It became infrastructure for empire. Chapter 7. Merchants before soldiers. An empire is often imagined as the result of conquest. Maps are redrawn by generals, borders are shifted by battles, and history remembers the noise of cannons and marching boots. But the British experience followed a quieter sequence. Before soldiers secured territory, merchants had already moved into it. Before flags were raised, contracts were signed. Before armies established control, trade had already built influence. The foundation of British expansion was not immediate military occupation. It was economic entry. Commercial networks reached foreign regions long before formal governance structures appeared. Trading posts, warehouses, and shipping routes created early footholds that gradually evolved into deeper forms of control. The East India Company became the clearest example of this pattern. It did not arrive as a conquering force in the beginning. It entered as a trading entity seeking profit in existing markets. Over time, however, its presence expanded through agreements, alliances, and strategic advantages. Economic presence created dependency. Dependency created leverage, and leverage created authority. What started as exchange eventually turned into influence over local political systems. The ability to control trade flows often mattered more than direct territorial occupation. Those who regulated access to goods and markets held power without immediately declaring sovereignty. This approach reduced the need for early large-scale military deployment. Instead of conquering outright, Britain embedded itself within existing structures and gradually strengthened its position from within. Commerce functioned as an entry strategy. Military force functioned as consolidation. Finance provided sustainability. Together, these elements formed a layered system of expansion. Merchants acted as the first agents of empire. Their decisions about pricing, routes, and partnerships shaped long-term geopolitical outcomes. A successful trading relationship could evolve into diplomatic influence. A strategic port could become a center of administration. A profitable region could attract deeper institutional involvement. Over time, boundaries between private enterprise and state authority became increasingly blurred. Companies operated with governmental privileges. Governments relied on commercial revenue. The distinction between economic and political power grew less distinct. This hybrid structure allowed Britain to extend its reach with remarkable efficiency. It could expand influence without immediately assuming full administrative responsibility. That reduced costs while increasing flexibility. Soldiers were still essential, but they often followed established commercial pathways rather than leading expansion. In many regions, the sequence was consistent. Merchants arrive, trade develops, profits increase, political ties deepen, and only then does formal control emerge. This gradual progression gave the British system resilience. It avoided the immediate burden of direct rule while still accumulating long-term authority. Economic integration became the precursor to political domination. The result was a form of empire built on layers rather than sudden conquest. Each layer reinforced the next. Trade created presence, presence created influence, influence created control, and control eventually required military backing to stabilize. By the time full imperial structures were established, much of the groundwork had already been completed by commerce and finance. The story of British expansion, therefore, cannot be understood solely through battles and treaties. It must also be read through ledgers, shipping records, and investment flows. Power did not begin on the battlefield. It began in markets. And by the time soldiers arrived, much of the empire had already been built by merchants. An empire wasn't first carved by swords. It was built in markets, ships, and bank ledgers long before it was defended on battlefields. By the time soldiers arrived, the merchants had already written the map of power. The company had shown Britain how profitable empire could be, but profit alone could not control a world-spanning territory. Britain needed something far more powerful, a system. What if Britain didn't rule the world through armies at all, but through systems that reshaped how power itself worked? Because while empires measured strength in soldiers and territory, Britain was building something different. Control mechanisms that operated across oceans, time zones, and economies. Ships that moved faster than rivals could respond. Networks that carried decisions instantly. And infrastructure that quietly defined who could act and who could only react. And once that system reached the sea, geography stopped being a barrier and became an advantage. That's where it truly begins. Chapter 1: Masters of the Sea. The empire didn't begin with land, it began with water. And the moment Britain learned to treat the ocean not as a barrier, but as a managed space, global power stopped being regional and became operational. There was a time when distance meant uncertainty. Ships vanished beyond horizons, decisions slowed to weeks, and control fractured the moment it left shore. Most powers built armies to hold territory. Britain did something more decisive. It engineered permanence on movement itself. The Royal Navy became the core instrument of that transformation. Not simply a fleet, but a system designed for reach, endurance, and interruption. Sea lanes were not defended in the traditional sense, they were structured. Routes were monitored, resupplied, and enforced with a discipline that made disruption expensive and unsustainable for rivals. Control was no longer about occupying land, it was about governing circulation. Ports across the world began to function like nodes in a single operational network. From the Caribbean to the Indian Ocean, refueling stations and naval bases extended range far beyond natural limits. What once required proximity now required only access, and access, once established, became dependency. This is where geography itself started to lose neutrality. Choke points like narrow straits and canal routes were no longer just features on a map. They became strategic pressure valves. Whoever controlled them didn't just move ships. They influenced trade timing, military response, and economic rhythm. The ocean was no longer empty space. It was segmented, tracked, and quietly regulated. At the same time, Britain refined something even more important than firepower: predictability. A navy that could appear consistently, enforce rules uniformly, and respond faster than competitors did not need constant battles. Presence itself became deterrence. And deterrence, repeated across vast distances, replaced occupation as the primary form of control. This shift created a deeper asymmetry. Competing empires still thought in terms of campaigns and conquests. Britain was operating in cycles, logistics, and maintenance schedules. One system was episodic, the other was continuous. By the early 19th century, that continuity had reshaped global movement. Merchant fleets adjusted their routes to align with naval protection. Insurance costs reflected British enforcement zones. Trade corridors stabilized not through agreement, but through enforced reliability. In practice, the world's busiest maritime routes began to behave like extensions of a single organizing power. What emerged was not just naval superiority, but infrastructural dominance over motion itself. The sea did not belong to Britain in a legal sense. It functioned within British parameters. And once the oceans were structured in this way, every other domain, trade, empire, finance, was forced to adapt to the logic already in place. The machine had started at sea. Chapter 2: Steam and Acceleration. It didn't look like power at first. No flags, no armies, no declarations of conquest. Just heat, pressure, and metal learning to move faster than muscle ever could. But beneath the factory smoke of Britain, something fundamental had changed. Energy was no longer bound to geography or biology. It could be extracted, stored, and redirected at scale. And once movement stopped depending on wind, water, or human strength, acceleration itself became a strategic advantage. Steam engines transformed time into a resource. Production that once depended on seasons or manual labor began to follow mechanical rhythm. Factories no longer waited for conditions, they created them. Output became predictable, and predictability became power. Wealth stopped being tied to land alone and began accumulating through throughput. This shift didn't stay inside factories. It escaped into the world of logistics and warfare. Rail systems compressed distance across industrial Britain, turning hours into minutes. Materials moved with a consistency that older economies couldn't match. Armies supported by this infrastructure no longer fought at the same tempo as their rivals. They arrived faster, sustained longer, and replenished continuously. What mattered was not just speed, but synchronization. Coal, iron, labor, and capital began to operate as a coordinated system. Each element amplified the others. The result was not linear growth, it was compounding acceleration. Every improvement increased the capacity for the next improvement. By comparison, traditional states remained structurally slower. Their logistics depended on terrain, weather, and fragmented supply chains. Even when they adopted similar technologies, they often did so without the integrated industrial base that made them decisive. The technology existed, but the system behind it did not. Britain's advantage was not invention alone, it was integration. The same steam power that drove mills also powered ships. The same rail logic that moved goods inland also reshaped imperial supply routes. Domestic industry and global expansion became extensions of a single operational model. As production scaled upward, so did surplus. That surplus did not remain local. It flowed outward through trade networks already secured by naval control. Manufactured goods entered global markets faster than competitors could replicate similar capacity. Economic influence began to mirror industrial output. At this point, wealth itself changed character. It was no longer static accumulation, but continuous motion, investment, reinvestment, expansion. Capital behaved like steam, pressurized, directed, and constantly seeking new pathways. Financial institutions evolved alongside industrial ones, ensuring that expansion never stalled for lack of coordination. Acceleration became self-reinforcing. More production required more transport required more infrastructure. More infrastructure enabled even greater production. Each layer strengthened the next, creating a system that was difficult to match without rebuilding the entire structure from the ground up. And once this industrial momentum aligned with Britain's naval reach, the two systems began to reinforce each other globally, one controlling movement on land and sea, the other increasing the volume and speed of what moved. The world was no longer just connected. It was accelerating under uneven control. Chapter 3: The Speed of Information. Power has always depended on delay. The slower information moves, the easier it is to control. But what happens when distance stops meaning ignorance, and the edge of the empire can speak to its center instantly? That question didn't begin as a revolution. It began as a wire. Buried beneath soil, stretched under oceans, and strung across continents, the telegraph did something no empire had ever achieved before. It detached decision-making from geography. For the first time in history, command no longer traveled at the speed of horses or ships. It traveled at the speed of electricity. And that changed everything. A colonial governor in Asia could no longer act in isolation. A military movement in Africa could be corrected before it fully unfolded. Markets stopped reacting to local reality alone. They started reacting to distant instructions. Time zones still existed, but political time collapsed into a single synchronized system. The Royal Navy had already controlled movement across the seas. Steam had accelerated production and transport. But the telegraph introduced something more subtle and more decisive: simultaneity. Events in one part of the world were no longer later. For another part, they were now immediate inputs into a centralized awareness. This created a new kind of empire, one that did not rely on presence, but on coordination. Administrators were no longer autonomous actors scattered across territories. They became nodes in a communication grid, constantly updated, constantly corrected. Authority shifted upward, not through force, but through informational dependency. In earlier systems, distance created opportunity for divergence. Decisions adapted locally, sometimes beyond imperial oversight. The telegraph removed that flexibility. It compressed interpretation, it narrowed response windows, and in doing so, it reduced the range of possible resistance strategies. Even economic behavior changed under this pressure. Commodity prices, shipping conditions, and political risks were no longer regional secrets. They became shared data points across the imperial network. Markets began to anticipate movement rather than react to it, producing feedback loops that reinforced central influence over global trade rhythms. But the deeper transformation was psychological. For administrators, merchants, and military planners, uncertainty was no longer spatial. It became temporal. The question was not, "What is happening there?" but, "What has just been reported?" Reality itself became a sequence of updates rather than a set of local experiences. This shift made the empire function less like a collection of territories and more like a single operational intelligence system. The British state could observe, respond, and adjust across vast distances without physically relocating power. Control became informational before it became physical. And once information moved instantly, every other system, naval strategy, industrial production, financial expansion, was forced to align with that rhythm. The empire was no longer just moving faster, it was thinking faster. Chapter 4: Railways of Control. The true power of railways was never transportation. It was compression of space, of resistance, and of choice. Before rail networks, control over large territories was always uneven. Authority weakened with distance. Local actors adapted, delayed, or simply ignored directives when enforcement was too far away. Empire, in practice, dissolved at its edges. Railways changed that geometry. A locomotive does not negotiate terrain in the way an army does. It standardizes it. Mountains are cut through, rivers are bridged, and distances that once demanded weeks collapse into hours. But the deeper transformation was not speed, it was predictability. Timetables replaced uncertainty. Movement became scheduled, repeatable, and enforceable. This mattered because control depends less on presence than on timing. When goods, troops, and officials can be moved on demand, governance stops being reactive. It becomes operational. In colonial systems, rail lines were not neutral infrastructure. They were deliberately designed to connect extraction zones to ports, not cities to each other. This created directional economies. Raw materials flowed outward, manufactured goods flowed inward. The network did not simply move people, it organized value. Along these corridors, new administrative realities emerged. A district that lay along a rail line became fundamentally different from one that did not. Access to markets, enforcement units, and political communication was no longer uniform. Geography was re-ranked by proximity to rails, not just borders. Military logic adapted immediately. Garrisons were positioned to respond along rail arteries rather than across open terrain. Reinforcements could be deployed with a speed that made rebellion structurally riskier. Resistance no longer had to be defeated everywhere, only along key junctions where movement converged. But the more profound shift was economic discipline through infrastructure. Rail schedules imposed rhythm on entire regions. Agricultural cycles, labor migration, and commodity trading began to align with train availability. Local economies adapted not to natural time, but to mechanical time. This synchronization created dependency. Without rail access, markets became isolated. Without scheduling integration, production lost competitiveness. Over time, infrastructure ceased to be an advantage and became a requirement for participation in the economy at all. Colonial administration embedded itself into this structure. Taxes, legal authority, and resource allocation were increasingly tied to rail accessibility. Governance became spatially selective, reinforcing hierarchy through connectivity rather than explicit force. Yet the system's strength also revealed its logic. It was not designed to integrate territories equally. It was designed to optimize flow toward strategic endpoints. Every track led somewhere specific. Every junction served a calculated purpose. Nothing was neutral. Once established, the railway network functioned as a political skeleton. It held the empire together not through ideology, but through logistics. Even when political authority wavered, the infrastructure remained operational, continuing to shape movement and economic behavior. And when combined with naval reach and telegraphic coordination, railways completed a tri-layer system. Oceans controlled access, wires controlled decisions, and rails controlled the interior. Empire was no longer just expansion, it was architecture. Chapter 5: The Suez Shortcut. Empires rarely collapse because they are attacked. They collapse when their timing breaks. For Britain, the most dangerous vulnerability was never land invasion. It was delay. Every extra week between London and the Indian Ocean added uncertainty to trade, command, and military coordination. Distance was not just geographic, it was strategic friction. And friction at imperial scale is a cost that compounds. The Suez Canal did not simply reduce distance, it rewrote the geometry of global power. Before its opening, maritime routes between Europe and Asia required a long passage around the southern tip of Africa. That journey shaped everything: shipping costs, naval deployment cycles, and even the tempo of imperial decision-making. The world was effectively split into slow circuits of movement, each vulnerable to disruption and seasonal constraint. Suez collapsed that separation. By cutting directly through the Isthmus of Suez, the canal transformed the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean into a continuous corridor. What had been two distinct maritime worlds became a single integrated artery. Travel time shrank dramatically, but the real transformation was systemic. Logistical predictability replaced geographic uncertainty. This mattered because Britain's global position depended on synchronized systems. The Navy required rapid redeployment between theaters. Trade routes depended on stable transit times. Administrative decisions needed reliable feedback loops from distant colonies. The canal became the keystone that aligned all of these requirements. Control of this corridor therefore meant control over global rhythm. Whoever influenced Suez influenced not just movement, but scheduling itself. When ships departed, when resources arrived, and when military support could be expected. In an interconnected system, timing is power. Britain understood this immediately. Securing influence over the canal region was not treated as optional diplomacy, it was treated as structural necessity. Naval presence in adjacent waters ensured that this single choke point remained within an operational security envelope. The canal was not merely a trade route, it was a regulated dependency. The economic effects were equally profound. Faster shipping cycles meant capital could rotate more quickly between production and consumption zones. Inventory costs fell. Market responsiveness increased. Commodities moved with fewer interruptions, tightening the link between imperial production centers and global demand. But the deeper consequence was strategic concentration. When routes become shorter and more efficient, they also become more predictable. And predictability creates vulnerability at specific points. Suez became one of those points. A disruption there did not fragment the system, it paralyzed it. This is what made the canal different from earlier maritime innovations. It did not expand the map of empire, it compressed it. And in doing so, it intensified the importance of every node connected to it. Ports, coaling stations, naval bases, and financial centers all became more tightly interdependent. Once Suez entered the system, the empire's earlier components, naval dominance, industrial output, telegraphic coordination, and rail logistics, began to operate on a single synchronized loop. Information, goods, and force all moved with reduced lag across the same corridor structure. At that point, geography itself stopped being a sequence of distances. It became a managed network of choke points, and Suez was the most critical of them all. Chapter 6: Pax Britannica. Peace is rarely the absence of conflict. More often, it is the presence of a power strong enough to decide where conflict is allowed to happen. In the 19th century, that power was Britain. At sea, its navy enforced a level of dominance that made large-scale interstate war between major European powers less frequent and more carefully constrained. Trade routes were protected, piracy was suppressed, maritime disruption became increasingly risky and expensive. On the surface, this looked like stability, a world settling into order after centuries of volatility. This condition came to be described as Pax Britannica, but the peace was not evenly distributed. It was structured. Britain's control of naval corridors meant that global movement, goods, capital, and military force operated within parameters it could influence. Shipping lanes were secured not for universal safety, but for predictable circulation. The system was designed to reduce uncertainty for the center, not necessarily for the periphery. For many regions outside Europe, this peace was experienced differently. It often arrived through gunboat diplomacy, enforced treaties, and economic restructuring that tied local economies into global networks on unequal terms. Stability, in this context, meant reduced autonomy. Colonial territories were drawn into a system where violence was less visible but still embedded in structure. Direct conquest gave way to administrative control, supported by naval presence, financial dependency, and infrastructure alignment. Resistance did not disappear. It became harder to organize across compressed response times and integrated surveillance of movement and trade. The global economy that emerged under this order was increasingly interconnected, but not symmetrical. Raw materials flowed outward from colonies toward industrial centers. Manufactured goods and capital flowed inward. Prices, demand, and production cycles were increasingly shaped by metropolitan markets rather than local conditions. This created a form of dependency that did not require constant coercion. Once established, it became self-reinforcing. Economies adapted to external demand signals. Infrastructure was built to serve export routes. Administrative systems prioritized external trade stability over internal diversification. Meanwhile, naval supremacy ensured that alternative routes or independent trade systems were difficult to sustain at scale. The seas were open in principle, but regulated in practice. access existed, but under conditions defined by dominant maritime power. Even within Europe, this stability had limits. Rivalries were managed rather than eliminated. The balance of power persisted, but under the shadow of British logistical reach and financial influence. Peace was maintained not by removing tension, but by controlling its escalation pathways. The cost of this order was absorbed unevenly. Colonies bore the burden of extraction systems, labor demands, and constrained development paths. Peripheral economies often became locked into single resource dependencies that limited long-term industrial diversification. Local political structures were reshaped to maintain external integration rather than internal balance. Yet, from the perspective of imperial centers, the system appeared remarkably stable. Trade expanded. Naval conflict remained limited. Financial markets grew more interconnected. The world seemed to enter a phase of managed equilibrium. But that equilibrium was conditional. It depended on continuous naval dominance, synchronized infrastructure, and a financial architecture that routed global flows through specific hubs. It was not natural stability. It was engineered stability. And like all engineered systems, it was strongest at the center, and most fragile at the edges where control was indirect, and resistance could still accumulate in quieter forms. Pax Britannica, in the end, was less a period of peace than a period of organized imbalance, maintained through systems that made disruption visible before it became uncontrollable. Chapter 7. The Impossible Resistance. Resistance is often imagined as a matter of will. History suggests something colder. It is a matter of systems. By the time British power reached its peak, opposition was no longer facing a single army or a single fleet. It was facing an interlocked structure: naval dominance at sea, industrial acceleration on land, telegraphic synchronization in command, and rail-based enforcement within territories. Each layer reinforced the others. Taken separately, they were powerful. Together, they formed a closed operational environment. The first structural barrier was fragmentation. Many regions under imperial pressure were not unified political entities. Authority was divided among competing local powers, shifting alliances, and uneven administrative capacity. This meant resistance rarely emerged as a coordinated system. It appeared in isolated bursts, localized uprisings, regional conflicts, or short-lived coalitions that lacked sustained integration across geography. Even when intent existed, synchronization did not. And in a world increasingly defined by speed, lack of coordination became a decisive weakness. The second barrier was technological asymmetry. Industrial production did not just increase output, it redefined scalability. Armaments, logistics, and communication tools were produced at levels that traditional economies could not match. Railways moved troops faster than terrain-based movement could adapt. Steam-powered naval forces extended reach beyond wind-dependent fleets. Telegraphic systems compressed decision cycles into near real-time feedback loops. Opposition forces often fought in temporal mismatch. One side operated on delayed awareness, the other on immediate correction. That gap alone reshaped outcomes before direct confrontation even occurred. The third barrier was financial dependency. By the 19th century, global finance had become deeply integrated with imperial trade systems. Credit, insurance, shipping, and commodity pricing were increasingly routed through networks centered in metropolitan hubs. This meant that even regions capable of political resistance often depended on the same systems for economic survival. Disruption carried structural cost. Breaking away from imperial networks risked collapse of trade access, capital flow, and import systems. In many cases, resistance had to choose between political autonomy and economic continuity, choices that weakened long-term sustainability. There was also an informational constraint layered on top of these factors. With telegraph networks accelerating communication, imperial authorities could respond to emerging resistance faster than it could expand. Local movements that once might have gained momentum over months were now monitored, interpreted, and countered within days or even hours. This did not eliminate resistance, but it reduced its ability to scale before containment. Rail infrastructure further narrowed the space for prolonged rebellion. Control points, junctions, ports, supply depots became critical nodes. Once secured, they limited the mobility of opposing forces. Geography no longer provided the same protective depth it once had. In combination, these systems produced a structural imbalance rather than a purely military one. Resistance was not only confronted, it was pre-structured into disadvantage. The environment itself favored centralized coordination over dispersed opposition. Yet none of this implies absence of resistance. It persisted continuously, in varying forms and intensities. But it often remained local, fragmented, or absorbed into larger systemic pressures before it could fully unify. The result was not an empire without opposition, but an opposition constrained by architecture. And that architecture, built across sea, industry, information, and infrastructure, defined the limits of what resistance could realistically become. Empire did not end because it weakened. It ended because its systems stopped aligning the way they once did. What Britain built was not just power, but a machine that turned sea, industry, information, and infrastructure into one coordinated force. And when that coordination began to shift, the illusion of permanence collapsed into reconfiguration. In the end, empire was never a moment. It was a system, and systems always outlive their designers in different forms. But every empire has a price, and the wealth flowing back to Britain came from somewhere and from someone. 3 million enslaved Africans, $45 trillion drained from India, and 40,000 miles of railways held up as proof of civilization. What if I told you that the most powerful empire in human history, an empire that controlled over a quarter of the Earth's surface, justified every act of violence, every famine, every war, with one simple word: progress? They built railways across India. They ended the slave trade. They spread the English language to every corner of the globe. These are the facts the empire wanted you to remember. But there are other facts. 60 million deaths. Entire economies deliberately dismantled. A country so wealthy it was called the Golden Bird, reduced to one of the poorest nations on Earth. Opium forced into China at gunpoint. Ireland starved while food sailed out of its own ports. Rebellions crushed. Cultures erased. So here's the question that historians, politicians, and ordinary people have been arguing about for over a century. Did the British Empire bring progress or exploitation? And more importantly, can it be both? Welcome to Midnight Empire. I'm your host, and tonight in episode 4, we're not picking a side. We're following the evidence, wherever it leads. This is the contradictions of empire. Chapter 1. The question no one wants to answer. In 2020, statues started falling. In Bristol, England, the statue of slave trader Edward Colston was torn down and thrown into the harbor, the same harbor from which his ships once carried enslaved Africans. In London, protesters spray-painted "Was a racist" beneath a statue of Winston Churchill. Years earlier, at Oxford Union, Indian MP and author Shashi Tharoor delivered a speech that went viral across the world, arguing that Britain's wealth had been built in part on the exploitation of India, and that the empire owed a moral debt to its former colony. And in British classrooms, surveys showed that a majority of people still believed the empire was something to be proud of. How can the same institution inspire both pride and fury? How can historians call it both the greatest force for free trade and the architect of the world's worst famines? The answer is, it was both. And understanding how it was both is the only way to understand the modern world. Let's start where the empire hit hardest. Chapter 2. The Jewel in the Crown, India. In the year 1700, India accounted for roughly 27% of global GDP. By the time the British left in 1947, that number had fallen to under 4%. Let that sink in. The Indian subcontinent, once home to the richest civilizations, the finest textiles, the most advanced mathematics, had been systematically drained. But it didn't happen overnight, and it didn't begin with soldiers. It began with a corporation. The British East India Company, a private trading company, arrived in India in 1600. Within 150 years, it had its own army. By 1757, after the Battle of Plassey, it had effectively seized control of Bengal, one of the wealthiest regions on Earth. What followed was extraction on an industrial scale. The company began taxing Indian farmers and weavers, then used those very taxes to buy Indian goods to sell back to Britain. In other words, India was paying for its own plunder. Historian Utsa Patnaik, using 2 centuries of data, estimated that Britain drained approximately $45 trillion from India between 1765 and 1938. That's not a typo. $45 trillion. The famous Indian textile industry, the muslin of Dhaka, so fine it was called woven air, was deliberately destroyed. British manufacturers lobbied Parliament to impose tariffs on Indian cloth while flooding India with cheap British mill products. Weavers lost their livelihoods. Some accounts from the era described weavers cutting off their own thumbs in protest. And then there were the railways. Apologists for the empire often point to India's railway network, 40,000 miles of track, the 4th largest in the world by 1900, as proof of Britain's developmental mission. But here's what they don't tell you. Those railways were financed by Indian taxpayers, built to move British goods into Indian markets, and designed to transport troops to suppress Indian rebellions. The profits went to British shareholders. The debt stayed with India. As the economist Dadabhai Naoroji, the first Indian elected to British Parliament, called it a drain theory. India was not being developed, it was being consumed. Chapter 3. The Opium Trap, China's Forced Addiction. By the early 1800s, Britain had a problem. The British were obsessed with tea, Chinese tea. But China wasn't interested in British goods. The trade deficit was enormous. Silver was flowing out of Britain and into China at an unsustainable rate. So British merchants, backed by the East India Company, found a solution: opium. Grown in British-controlled India, smuggled into China against the explicit laws of the Chinese government, opium became the perfect product. It created demand, it was addictive, and it fixed the trade deficit. By the 1830s, an estimated 10 to 12 million Chinese people were addicted to opium. The Chinese emperor banned it, confiscated British opium stockpiles, tried to stop the trade. Britain responded by launching a war. The First Opium War, 1839 to 1842. The Second, 1856 to 1860. Britain's industrial military crushed Chinese resistance. The resulting treaties, which the Chinese called unequal treaties, forced China to open ports, pay reparations, and legalize the opium trade. Hong Kong was handed to Britain. Sovereignty was stripped. A civilization that had led the world in science, philosophy, and governance for millennia was humiliated. The Chinese word for this period is Banyan Guoqi, the century of humiliation. And it didn't end until 1949. Understanding modern China, its nationalism, its relationship with the West, its fierce defense of sovereignty, is impossible without understanding the Opium Wars. This was not free trade. This was narco-imperialism at gunpoint. Chapter 4. The Forgotten Famine, Ireland. In 1845, a potato blight struck Ireland. Within 5 years, approximately 1 million people were dead. Another million had emigrated. Ireland's population, which stood at about 8 million, would fall to 4 million by the end of the century, and it has never fully recovered to this day. This is known as An Gorta Mór, the Great Hunger. But here is the detail that transforms a tragedy into something more disturbing. While the Irish were starving, while mothers watched their children die, food was leaving Ireland. Ships loaded with grain, cattle, and butter sailed out of Irish ports, bound for Britain. In the worst years of the famine, Ireland was a net exporter of food. The British government, operating under a rigid free market ideology, refused to intervene meaningfully. They believed that government interference in the market would cause more harm than good. They ran soup kitchens for a brief period, then shut them down. Some British officials, like Assistant Secretary Charles Trevelyan, saw the famine as a providential correction, a brutal but natural solution to Irish overpopulation. He wrote that the judgment of God had sent the calamity to teach the Irish a lesson. He was later knighted. Many Irish historians and scholars use the word genocide. Others argue it was criminal negligence. The debate continues. What is not in debate, that Britain had the resources to prevent mass death and chose not to use them. That food left a starving country, and that Irish land remained in the hands of British landlords who continued to collect rent from people who could not eat. The Irish diaspora, born from that famine, would reshape America, Australia, and the world. And the memory of An Gorta Mór would fuel Irish nationalism for generations, culminating in the Easter Rising of 1916 and independence in 1922. Chapter 5. The Original Sin, Slavery. Between 1640 and 1807, Britain transported approximately 3.1 million enslaved Africans across the Atlantic. Not all survived the crossing. An estimated 15 to 20% died in the brutal conditions of the Middle Passage, chained below decks, with no space to stand, in disease-ridden holds, for weeks at sea. Those who survived were sold into a lifetime of forced labor on plantations in the Caribbean, the American South, and elsewhere, producing the sugar, tobacco, and cotton that fueled Britain's Industrial Revolution. Historian Eric Williams, in his landmark work Capitalism and Slavery, argued that the profits from enslaved labor were a direct financial foundation of British industrial capitalism. The banks, the insurance companies, the textile mills of Manchester, all benefited from the slave economy. Britain abolished the slave trade in 1807 and abolished slavery itself in 1833. And the empire's apologists often cite this as proof of Britain's moral leadership. But here's what they rarely mention. When Britain abolished slavery, the government paid £20 million in compensation, equivalent to roughly 16 to 17 billion pounds today. Not to the enslaved people, to the slave owners. The formerly enslaved received nothing. And some of that compensation debt, believe it or not, was not fully paid off by the British government until 2015. Meaning British taxpayers, including descendants of enslaved people living in the UK, were paying off the debt owed to slaveholders well into the 21st century. This is not ancient history. This is memory. Chapter 6. Engineered Starvation, the Colonial Famines. Between 1876 and 1879, a famine struck southern India. Conservative estimates put the death toll at 5 to 6 million people. Some historians say the true number was closer to 10 million. During that same famine, as people starved in Madras and Bombay, the British Viceroy, Lord Lytton, hosted a spectacular feast for 68,000 people in Delhi to celebrate Queen Victoria's proclamation as Empress of India. Grain continued to be exported from India throughout the famine. Historian Mike Davis, in his devastating book Late Victorian Holocausts, documented how Victorian-era free market policies imposed by the British government transformed regional droughts into mass death events across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The argument is not that Britain caused the droughts. Droughts happen. The argument is that British policy, forcing colonized people to grow cash crops instead of food, extracting grain for export, dismantling traditional famine relief systems, and rigidly enforcing free market ideology, turned manageable hardships into catastrophes. Between 1850 and 1900, India suffered 12 major famines. In the 2 centuries before British rule, it had suffered only 17 in total, across a much longer period. Davis estimates that somewhere between 12 and 29 million Indians died in famines during the last quarter of the 19th century alone. He calls these events, deliberately or through callous neglect, a form of late Victorian genocide. Chapter 7. The Fire That Fought Back, Rebellions. The colonized were not passive. They fought back, constantly, at great cost. In 1857, Indian soldiers, called sepoys, rose against the East India Company in what the British called the Sepoy Mutiny. Indians call it the First War of Independence. The uprising spread across northern India, drawing in princes, farmers, and soldiers united by one thing: rage at British rule. The British response was overwhelming and brutal. Rebels were tied to the mouths of cannons and blown apart as a public spectacle. Villages were burned. Tens of thousands were killed. After 1857, the East India Company was dissolved. The British Crown took direct control of India. The empire doubled down. In April 1919, in the city of Amritsar in the Punjab, British General Reginald Dyer ordered his troops to open fire on an unarmed crowd gathered in a walled garden called Jallianwala Bagh, a crowd that included women and children attending a peaceful festival. The soldiers fired for 10 minutes. Official British figures recorded 379 dead. Indian estimates put the number in the thousands. The exits were blocked. There was nowhere to run. General Dyer was forced to retire, but received a hero's welcome in Britain. A newspaper fund raised £26,000 for him as a token of public appreciation. In Kenya in the 1950s, the Mau Mau uprising against British colonial rule was suppressed through the systematic use of torture, detention camps, and collective punishment. British forces detained over 150,000 Kenyans. Thousands were killed, tortured, and castrated. In 2013, the British government officially apologized and paid £19.9 million to over 5,000 survivors. From Jamaica to India, from Ireland to Kenya, wherever the British Empire extended its reach, people resisted. Their stories are not footnotes. They are the spine of this history. Chapter 8. The Other Side. The Case for the Empire. Now, in the spirit of honest history, let's hear the other argument, because there are serious historians and thinkers who argue that the British Empire, for all its crimes, also left behind things of lasting value. The railways. India's rail network connected a vast subcontinent, enabling commerce and movement on a scale never before seen. Whatever the original intent, those tracks remained after independence and became a foundation for the world's largest democracy. The legal system. British rule introduced common law traditions, independent judiciaries, and constitutional frameworks that, imperfect and often hypocritical as they were, gave independence movements legal tools to demand their rights. Gandhi himself was a British-trained barrister who used British legal principles against the British. The abolition of the slave trade. Britain did lead the international campaign to end the transatlantic slave trade, deploying the Royal Navy to intercept slave ships. The empire's role in abolition was real, even if the empire had also been the engine of the trade in the first place. The English language. As a global medium of communication, English has enabled cross-border science, commerce, and diplomacy in ways that have, arguably, benefited billions of people, including in formerly colonized nations. And some scholars, like Niall Ferguson, have argued that British colonialism, compared to other colonial powers, was often less brutal, more invested in local institutions, and more willing to eventually transfer power, pointing to the relatively peaceful independence of India compared to, say, the French departure from Algeria. These arguments are real. They deserve to be heard. But, and this is critical, they do not cancel out the famines, the slavery, the opium trade, the massacres. Benefits and atrocities are not a ledger you balance. You don't subtract Jallianwala Bagh from the railway timetable and call it even. History is not accounting. Chapter 9. The Verdict. Was it worth it? So, did the British Empire bring progress or exploitation? The honest answer is, it brought both, deliberately entangled. The railways were built, but they were built to serve the empire, not the colonized. The legal systems were introduced, but they were selectively applied, denying rights to the very people they governed. Slavery was abolished. by the empire that had built its wealth on slavery. Education was spread in a language designed to create a class of people, as Macaulay famously put it, Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. Every act of development was shadowed by an act of extraction. Every railway track ran alongside a drain. The deeper question is this: who decided what counted as progress? Because the people who were colonized were rarely asked. Their economies were not developed. They were restructured to serve someone else's interests. Their famines were not prevented. They were in many cases made possible by policy choices made in London. Economic historian Angus Maddison's data shows that India's share of world manufacturing declined from 25% in 1750 to 2% in 1900. That is not the natural arc of development. That is the result of a deliberate economic system. And yet, India is a democracy. China has reclaimed its power. Ireland has one of the fastest growing economies in Europe. Kenya, Jamaica, Nigeria, all navigating their own paths forward, carrying the scars and sometimes the tools of colonialism simultaneously. The world the empire made is the world we live in now. The borders it drew, in Africa, in the Middle East, in South Asia, still generate conflict today. Understanding this is not about guilt. It's not about tearing down every statue. It's about seeing clearly, with both eyes open, what actually happened and why it still matters. Because you cannot understand the world without understanding the empire. And you cannot understand the empire without looking at its contradictions, full in the face. Next episode, we go deeper into how the British Empire ended, the independence movements, the Cold War scramble for post-colonial allegiances, the moment the sun finally set. For 2 centuries, Britain had expanded, extracted, and ruled. But by the 20th century, the system that had built the empire was beginning to destroy it. Why did the most powerful empire in history surrender its dominance? At its peak, the British Empire governed nearly a quarter of the world's land and population. Its navy ruled the oceans. Its currency shaped global trade. Its flag flew across continents, leading many to say, the sun never sets on the British Empire. Yet within just a few decades, that seemingly invincible empire unraveled. Was it defeated by stronger enemies? Crushed by 2 world wars? Bankrupted by the cost of empire? Or did millions of people across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East simply refuse to be ruled any longer? The truth is more complex than any single explanation. This is not a story of heroes and villains. It is a story of power, economics, war, political change, and the relentless pursuit of self-determination. Because history teaches us a remarkable lesson. No empire, however dominant, remains unchallenged forever. So, what really brought the British Empire to its end? Chapter 1: Empire at its peak. Imagine waking up in London and knowing that somewhere across the globe, millions of people are beginning their day under your country's flag. From the bustling ports of India to the gold mines of Africa, from Caribbean sugar plantations to the sheep stations of Australia, the British Empire connected continents in a way no nation had ever achieved before. For many in Britain, it felt as though history itself was moving in their favor. But the very forces that built this extraordinary empire would also plant the seeds of its decline. By the early 20th century, Britain stood at the center of the global system. Historians often describe this period as Pax Britannica, a century in which British naval supremacy helped secure major sea routes and facilitated an unprecedented expansion of international trade. London's financial markets became the world's economic heartbeat. Insurance, banking, shipping, and investment all flowed through the city of London. If a merchant wanted to move tea from Asia, cotton from Egypt, rubber from Malaya, or wheat from Canada, chances were the transaction would involve British ships, British insurers, British banks, or all three. At its greatest extent in the early 1920s, following the end of the First World War, the British Empire governed nearly a quarter of the Earth's land surface and roughly a quarter of the world's population. Never before had a single empire exercised political authority over so many different peoples, cultures, languages, and landscapes. The phrase, "The sun never sets on the British Empire," was more than patriotic poetry. It reflected a geographical reality. As daylight faded over London, sunrise illuminated Sydney. As evening settled over Canada, morning began in India. Somewhere, every hour of every day, a British colony or dominion was bathed in sunlight. But maps can hide human stories. For a young engineer in Britain, the empire represented opportunity, a career building railways in India or bridges in Africa. For a Scottish shipbuilder, it meant steady contracts producing vessels that crossed every ocean. For families in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, it offered new beginnings on expanding frontiers. Yet for many living under imperial rule, the experience was far more complicated. Some local elites worked closely with British administrations, believing cooperation could bring education, infrastructure, or economic growth. Others saw something very different: foreign rule, limited political representation, unequal laws, and decisions made thousands of miles away in Westminster. Across the empire, millions of people experienced British power in profoundly different ways. That complexity is essential to understanding the empire itself. Britain did not become a global superpower by military strength alone. It combined industrial innovation, naval dominance, commercial networks, diplomacy, and administrative institutions into a system that projected influence across the globe. Steamships shortened distances. Telegraph cables carried messages in minutes rather than weeks. The Royal Navy protected maritime trade routes that linked an expanding world economy. To many contemporaries, Britain's dominance appeared permanent. Few could imagine that the empire, at the height of its confidence and reach, would one day struggle to maintain the very system it had spent centuries building. Yet history has a habit of challenging certainty. Within a single generation, two catastrophic world wars would transform the global balance of power. The empire that seemed too vast to fail would face pressures no navy, no treasury, and no government could fully control. And the first cracks were already beginning to form beneath the surface. Chapter 2. The Great War. On August 4th, 1914, Britain declared war. Few people celebrated. Most believed they would be home by Christmas. 4 years later, nearly an entire generation had been changed forever. When Europe descended into war in 1914, Britain did not enter the conflict to save its empire. It entered to uphold treaty commitments and prevent a hostile power from dominating the continent. Few expected the war to last more than a few months. Instead, it became one of the deadliest conflicts in human history, and the beginning of a profound shift in Britain's global position. The First World War was unlike any conflict the world had ever seen. Machine guns, heavy artillery, poison gas, submarines, and trench warfare transformed the battlefield into a landscape of industrial-scale destruction. Millions of soldiers disappeared into muddy trenches stretching across Europe, where gaining a few hundred yards of ground often came at the cost of thousands of lives. Britain could not fight this war alone. It turned to its empire. From India came more than 1 million soldiers and laborers. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and colonies across Africa and the Caribbean contributed troops, supplies, food, raw materials, and financial support. Sikh cavalry fought in France. Australian and New Zealand troops landed at Gallipoli. Canadian forces earned a formidable reputation on the Western Front. Across the empire, millions answered a war that had begun thousands of miles from their homes. For many, service was driven by loyalty, duty, economic opportunity, or the hope that sacrifice would be rewarded with greater political rights after the war. But the human cost was staggering. Families across Britain and the Empire mourned fathers, sons, brothers, and friends who never returned. When the guns finally fell silent in 1918, Britain stood among the victors. But victory came at an extraordinary price. The war had consumed enormous financial resources. To sustain 4 years of fighting, Britain borrowed heavily, particularly from the United States. The nation that had long been the world's leading creditor was now burdened with massive debts. Industries that once fueled economic expansion struggled to adapt to a changing post-war world. Rebuilding would take years, while the cost of supporting a global empire remained immense. The war also changed politics across the empire. Millions of colonial soldiers had fought beside British troops, risking their lives for a cause described as defending freedom and civilization. When they returned home, many began asking an uncomfortable question. If freedom was worth fighting for in Europe, why should it not exist in Asia or Africa as well? That question echoed from India to Egypt, from Ireland to parts of Africa. Demands for greater self-government grew louder. Nationalist movements gained confidence. Expectations had changed, and they would not easily be reversed. Ironically, the war even expanded Britain's empire. Under post-war international mandates, Britain assumed control of territories such as Iraq and Palestine, making the empire geographically larger than ever before. Yet appearances can be deceptive. The empire had reached its greatest territorial extent at precisely the moment its foundations were becoming more fragile. Britain possessed more land than ever, but fewer financial reserves. More global responsibilities, but less economic flexibility. More prestige, but growing political challenges across its colonies. The First World War did not destroy the British Empire, but it permanently altered the balance between power and cost. For the first time in generations, Britain's leaders confronted a difficult reality. Maintaining the world's largest empire was becoming far more expensive than building it. And within just 2 decades, an even greater war would push that fragile balance to its breaking point. Chapter 3: A Costly Victory. Britain defeated Hitler. It helped save Europe. It stood among the victors in 1945. Yet, hidden beneath the celebrations was a painful truth. The empire had won the war, but it had nearly bankrupted itself doing so. In 1939, Britain once again found itself at war in Europe. This time, the threat was even greater. Nazi Germany had launched a campaign of conquest that threatened the balance of power across the continent. Unlike the First World War, this was not simply a struggle over territory. It was a fight against a regime built on aggression, dictatorship, and genocide. Britain stood almost alone during the darkest months of the war. After the fall of France in 1940, the English Channel became the last barrier separating Britain from Nazi-controlled Europe. German bombers filled the skies during the Blitz, reducing entire neighborhoods to rubble. Night after night, ordinary families slept in underground stations as air raid sirens echoed through London. Cities burned, factories were destroyed, and thousands of civilians lost their lives. Yet Britain did not surrender. Its people endured rationing, blackouts, constant bombing, and years of uncertainty. The image of determination became central to Britain's wartime identity. Across the empire, millions once again joined the struggle. Soldiers from India, Africa, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and countless other territories fought on battlefields stretching from North Africa to Italy and Southeast Asia. Together, the Allied powers ultimately defeated Nazi Germany in Europe in 1945. It was one of history's greatest military victories. But when the celebrations ended, Britain faced a sobering reality. The country had survived the war, but it was financially exhausted. 6 years of total war had drained the national treasury. Factories had been converted from producing consumer goods to building tanks, aircraft, and warships. Infrastructure required rebuilding. Export industries had fallen behind international competitors. To finance the war, Britain had sold overseas assets, accumulated enormous debts, and become increasingly dependent on financial support from the United States. The global economic balance had shifted. Before the war, London had been the world's undisputed financial capital. After the war, that position increasingly belonged to New York. American industry had expanded dramatically during the conflict, while Britain's economy struggled simply to recover. Maintaining a worldwide empire suddenly looked less like a symbol of strength and more like an expensive obligation. Every colony required administrators, soldiers, infrastructure, shipping, and political attention. Protecting trade routes demanded a powerful navy. Responding to unrest required military deployments. All of this cost money that Britain no longer had in abundance. The war had also transformed international politics. The principles championed by the Allies, freedom, democracy, and the right of nations to determine their own future, resonated far beyond Europe. Across Asia and Africa, nationalist leaders argued that those same ideals should apply to people living under colonial rule. Many had fought for the British Empire. Now they expected the empire to recognize their own aspirations. At home, British voters were also demanding change. After years of sacrifice, they wanted better housing, healthcare, education, and employment. The government began investing heavily in rebuilding the country and expanding social programs. Every pound spent maintaining distant colonies was a pound unavailable for reconstruction at home. For policymakers in London, the question was becoming unavoidable. Could Britain remain both a global empire and a modern welfare state? Increasingly, the answer appeared to be no. The Second World War had secured Britain's place among the victors of history. But it had also accelerated a profound redistribution of global power. Britain emerged respected, admired for its resilience, and influential on the world stage. Yet beneath that prestige lay a difficult truth. The empire had won the war, but it could no longer afford the peace. And as Britain's resources declined, another nation was rapidly rising, one whose economic strength, military reach, and global influence would redefine the post-war world. Chapter 4: A New World Order. When the smoke of World War II finally cleared, the world searched for its next leader. For more than a century, that answer had been Britain. This time, the world's attention turned elsewhere, across the Atlantic. Britain had emerged from the war victorious, but victory no longer guaranteed global leadership. Its empire still stretched across continents. The Royal Navy remained one of the world's most powerful fleets. British diplomats continued to influence international affairs. Yet behind those familiar symbols, a new balance of power was quietly taking shape. The United States had escaped the widespread destruction that devastated Europe and much of Asia. While entire cities overseas lay in ruins, American factories had expanded at extraordinary speed, producing ships, aircraft, vehicles, steel, and machinery on an unprecedented scale. Its economy had become the strongest on Earth, and its financial influence now reached every continent. At the same time, another superpower emerged from the ashes of war. The Soviet Union had suffered unimaginable losses, tens of millions of lives, but it possessed one of the world's largest armies and controlled much of Eastern Europe. Within a few years, international politics would revolve around the rivalry between Washington and Moscow. The age of European empires was giving way to the age of superpowers. Britain suddenly found itself navigating a world it no longer controlled. For generations, London had shaped the rules of international commerce and diplomacy. Now, many of the most important decisions depended on cooperation with Washington. Intelligence sharing, military planning, financial assistance, and nuclear strategy increasingly reflected an Anglo-American partnership, but one in which the United States held the greater influence. The economic transformation was equally dramatic. The British pound gradually lost its position as the world's dominant reserve currency, while the US dollar became the foundation of the international financial system. American corporations expanded across global markets. Hollywood films, consumer products, technological innovation, and industrial output projected American influence far beyond its borders. Global leadership itself was being redefined. Power was no longer measured simply by the number of colonies shown on a map. It depended on economic productivity, technological innovation, financial strength, and industrial capacity. Britain's leaders understood that reality. Maintaining direct control over a worldwide empire required money, troops, ships, and political attention, resources that had become increasingly scarce after two devastating wars. Meanwhile, the international mood was changing. The newly created United Nations promoted the principle of self-determination, while nationalist leaders across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East argued that the promises of freedom made during the war should apply to every nation, not only those in Europe. Even Britain's closest ally, the United States, often encouraged decolonization, although Cold War strategy sometimes complicated that position. By the early 1950s, Britain's challenge was no longer simply defending an empire. It was adapting to an entirely different world. The empire still existed, but the future no longer belonged to empires. And across Britain's colonies, millions of people recognized the opportunity history had created. If Britain was no longer the unquestioned center of global power, perhaps independence was no longer an impossible dream, but an approaching reality. Chapter 5: Freedom Rising. A young Indian soldier returned home wearing the king's uniform. An African veteran stepped off a military transport after years of fighting for the British Empire. They had risked their lives defending freedom overseas. Now they asked a question that would echo across the empire. If freedom was worth dying for in Europe, why shouldn't it belong to us? By the late 1940s, Britain faced a challenge unlike any it had encountered before. This enemy did not arrive in warships. It did not march with invading armies. It spread through speeches, newspapers, universities, labor unions, and public demonstrations. It was the growing belief that every nation had the right to govern itself. For generations, the British Empire had appeared too powerful to challenge. But 2 world wars had changed the political landscape forever. Britain was economically weakened, global opinion was shifting, and millions of colonial citizens had returned home with new confidence and new expectations. The turning point came in 1947. Britain granted independence to India, ending nearly 2 centuries of British rule over the subcontinent. It was one of the defining events of the 20th century, yet independence came at a heartbreaking cost. The partition of India created India and Pakistan, triggering one of the largest migrations in modern history. Millions fled across newly drawn borders as communal violence claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. For Britain, losing India meant far more than surrendering territory. India had long been called the jewel in the crown, the empire's largest colony and one of its greatest strategic and economic assets. If India could become independent, every other colony could imagine the same future. That realization spread rapidly. Across Asia, nationalist movements accelerated. Across Africa, a new generation of political leaders organized campaigns demanding constitutional reform, elections, and eventually full independence. Some countries achieved self-government through negotiation. Others endured years of conflict before colonial rule came to an end. Each nation followed its own path, but they were united by a common conviction. The future of their countries should no longer be decided in London. Britain's own leaders increasingly recognized the changing reality. Maintaining direct rule over distant territories required enormous financial resources, military commitments, and political attention at a time when the country was rebuilding after 2 devastating wars. At home, many British citizens wanted investment in housing, healthcare, education, and economic recovery, not endless imperial commitments overseas. The debate was no longer simply about power. It was about legitimacy. Could an empire built in the 19th century survive the political ideals of the 20th? Increasingly, the answer appeared to be no. By the early 1950s, the British Empire still looked enormous on the map. But maps can be misleading. The momentum of history had shifted. The question was no longer whether the empire would change. It was how Britain would respond to a world that no longer accepted imperial rule as inevitable. That answer would come in 1956, during a crisis that lasted only a few weeks, but forever changed Britain's place in the world. Chapter 6: Suez, the breaking point. In just a few weeks, Britain lost something it had spent centuries building. Not territory, not an army, but the world's belief that it was still the dominant global power. The place was Egypt. The year was 1956. History would remember it as the Suez Crisis. At first glance, the dispute seemed to revolve around a canal. In reality, it was a struggle over who would shape the post-war world. The Suez Canal was one of the most strategically important waterways on Earth. Since its opening in 1869, it had connected the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea, dramatically shortening the route between Europe and Asia. For Britain, it was far more than a shipping lane. It carried oil from the Middle East, linked military bases across the empire, and remained essential to Britain's global trade network. Although Egypt had become independent, Britain still regarded the canal as vital to its national interests. Then, in July 1956, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser announced that Egypt would nationalize the Suez Canal Company. Across Egypt, crowds celebrated what they saw as a long overdue assertion of national sovereignty. In London and Paris, the reaction was very different. British Prime Minister Anthony Eden feared that accepting Nasser's decision would signal weakness throughout the remaining empire. If one nation could successfully challenge Britain, others might soon follow. Behind closed doors, Britain, France, and Israel agreed on a secret plan. Israel would invade Egypt. Britain and France would intervene under the claim of separating the two sides and securing the canal. Militarily, the operation unfolded largely as planned. Diplomatically, it became a disaster. The world Britain had once dominated no longer existed. The United States refused to support the intervention. President Dwight D. Eisenhower opposed the invasion, fearing it would undermine Western credibility and strengthen Soviet influence across the developing world. At the same time, the Soviet Union condemned the attack and issued sharp threats. For the first time in modern history, Britain found itself facing intense pressure from both superpowers at once. The decisive blow was economic. Unable to sustain financial pressure and growing international isolation, Britain accepted a ceasefire and withdrew its forces. The battlefield had not defeated Britain. Politics had. Suez did not dismantle the British Empire overnight. Decolonization was already underway, and Britain's economic challenges had been growing for years. But the crisis destroyed one powerful illusion. Britain could no longer act as a global imperial power without the support of the United States. Around the world, governments drew the same conclusion. The era in which Britain could independently shape world events had come to an end. Many historians now regard the Suez Crisis as the defining moment when Britain's imperial identity gave way to a new role, one built on diplomacy, alliances, and partnership rather than colonial rule. The empire still existed, but after Suez, its future was no longer a question of if, only when. And within a generation, the map of the British Empire would be transformed forever. Chapter 7: The Final Sunset. One by one, the red patches disappeared from the map. A flag came down in one colony, then another, then another. For millions, those moments marked the birth of new nations. For Britain, they marked the quiet end of an empire that had once ruled nearly a quarter of the world. After the Suez Crisis, Britain's leaders increasingly accepted that the age of empire was drawing to a close. The question was no longer whether the empire could survive. It was how to manage its transformation peacefully. Throughout the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, colonies across Asia, Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific achieved independence. Some transitions were negotiated through constitutional reform and diplomacy. Others were shaped by violence, political upheaval, and years of conflict. Each nation carried its own history. Each independence movement reflected its own people, its own struggles, and its own hopes for the future. For many, independence brought celebration and possibility. For others, it also brought difficult challenges: new borders, economic uncertainty, political instability, and the complex legacy of colonial rule. Britain itself was changing as well. Instead of governing a global empire, it focused on rebuilding its economy, expanding social welfare, strengthening democratic institutions, and redefining its role through diplomacy, trade, and international alliances. Yet, the end of empire did not mean the end of every relationship. Many former colonies chose to remain members of the Commonwealth of Nations, a voluntary association built not on imperial authority, but on cooperation between sovereign states. The empire had evolved into something fundamentally different. Its political power had faded. Its historical connections remained. And that legacy is still debated today. Some argue that the British Empire helped spread parliamentary institutions, legal systems, global trade, and the English language. Others point to colonial exploitation, economic extraction, political repression, famine, and the lasting inequalities left behind. History offers evidence for both achievements and failures. That is why the British Empire cannot be understood through a single narrative. It was one of history's most influential empires. It was also one of its most controversial. Which brings us back to the question that began this journey. Why did the most powerful empire in history surrender its dominance? Not because of one battle, not because of one rebellion, not because of one political decision. It declined because history changed faster than the empire could adapt. 2 world wars exhausted Britain's economy. New superpowers reshaped the international order. Independence movements transformed the political landscape. The Suez Crisis revealed that imperial authority no longer matched reality. Together, these forces ended an empire that once appeared impossible to defeat. Perhaps that is history's greatest lesson. No empire lasts forever. Power can conquer continents. Wealth can shape the world. Technology can transform civilizations. But lasting leadership has always depended on one thing above all: the ability to adapt before history forces the change. That is how empires rise, and that is why they fall. Subscribe to Midnight Empire, where every empire has a story, and every story has a lesson.